This week I'm here to talk drugs, in particular opium and its use in Victorian society. Now, there are several images that will immediately spring to mind as soon as we think of this, thanks to various media and literary works throughout time. We've got the frequent use of opium by Sherlock Holmes, for one. We've got the grotty opium dens as seen in Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, more recently in Philip Pullman's Ruby and the Smoke, and we have Britain fighting two actual wars against China in order to apparently keep on selling heroin to the world. But the truth of opium and its place in Victorian society is both layered and complex. It isn't black and white, and it shouldn't be judged alongside modern standards. Now, the first thing to understand is that prior to the discovery and manufacture of aspirin, which came onto general release in 1891, or cocaine around 1885, opium, or derivatives of opium, were the only readily available painkiller on the market. So a lot of people who were partaking of popular opiates such as laudanum were doing so simply out of medical need rather than recreational drug habit, just in the same way that people might take codeine and morphine today. Think about this for a moment. Have you taken a painkiller recently? You know, for a headache, toothache, back or joint pain, period pain. These are all ailments for which laudanum or other opiates were recommended treatments. These people aren't junkies, they're just normal people with pain. Now, laudanum, the popular one, is basically a mixture of alcohol and about 10% opium, and it could be bought in grocery shops, pubs, tobacconists, even sweet shops without any trouble at all. And usually about 20 drops of laudanum would cost somewhere in the region of 1 penny, so it was both readily available and affordable to the poorer end of the working communities, who were invariably the people who most needed painkillers. It was marketed for virtually everything. For uses other than pain, we have a few examples here. First, here is a written prescription for 30 drops of laudanum as a treatment for cholera, which I'm sure helps a lot with such a crippling and dangerous disease. But then it's also here as a recipe for cough mixture, and that's a mixture of vinegar, treacle, and 60 drops of laudanum. 60. That's twice what you take for cholera. And right down at the other end of the scale, it's used as a child's sleeping aid or method of relieving things like teething pain. The most popular and well-known brand of laudanum-based sleeping aid was Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and this used happy children in its advertising. Look how content and happy those kids are. Yeah, because they're off their face on opium. But I digress. We laugh, but this is, like many things we talk about on this channel, just not as historic as you might think. I recall being given kaolin and morphine mixture as a young child as a remedy for stomach upset, digestive problems, and what is morphine if not an opiate? And that was in the late 1970s to early 1980s, and that mixture is still available today. Now, in 1821, Thomas de Quincey published a book entitled Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and the Kindle edition of which is available free. It's also available free through the Gutenberg Project, and we will put a link in the comments below and the description. Now, this book claimed that instead of the brain dulling effects of alcohol, laudanum improved the brain's creative functions, and as a result, more and more people who were searching for inspiration to create art or literature took up the use of laudanum, and the addictions just rise and rise. Famous, well-known literary names, literary greats like Dickens, Shelley, Stoker, Byron, and George Eliot were all known opium users. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote the poem Kubla Khan after waking up from an opium-induced trip, which is probably why its alternative title is A Vision in a Dream. Now, this all seems to deliver a reputation as a society of debauched drug abusers, but it's really not the case. Remember, this is an age before most painkillers, antidepressants, tranquilizers, or sleeping pills, and many people take these sorts of things today. It's also a time before the addictive nature of opium was truly understood. Think about this in the setting of a time where mental health is only just being explored. So someone who has taken opium may well be suffering withdrawal, having stopped. Now, this is going to manifest itself in the form of anxiety, depression, nausea, and possibly even hallucination. And these are all things that another dose of opium will cure. So what do we think the average doctor is going to recommend? Yeah, it takes an awful long time for science and society to get around to the idea that opium was the cause and not the cure. Now, the famous opium dens and debauched dungeons of the London Docklands did exist, but there really wasn't that many of them. You'd find them in the slums of Whitechapel and Limehouse, and therefore they're always associated with the immoral poor, something that the Victorians are very quick to jump to. But these dens catered mostly to seamen who had picked up their addiction in China and then sailed into the London docks on their various trade routes. They would stay, they would get their fix, and then they would depart again when the ship left shore. These are people that have money with them, they're not resorting to crime. The reputation's not helped either by an unhealthy level of anti-Chinese racism that exaggerates their presence even more. But really, if you didn't make the effort to go looking for an opium den, you'd never really know that they were there. Now, the first real restriction on the sale of opium comes in the form of the 1868 Pharmacy Act, which restricts the sale of opium to registered chemists, along with restrictions on the sale of arsenic, which we have covered in a couple of previous videos. However, this doesn't really dent the problem that much, as you don't need much in the way of qualification to be a registered chemist, and there are no limits on the amount of opium that you can sell to an individual. So broadly speaking, however there's a lot of Victorian paperwork to go along with that regulation, it doesn't really change anything that much. It did, however, have an effect on the supply, and therefore it increased the price, pushing it out of the reach of many working class people. The working classes can no longer do what the middle classes consider to be vulgar substance abuse, but the interfering middle class can still maintain its own cleaner and more civilised opiate habit. Very much the Victorian way. Now, towards the last decade of the 19th century, the opium trade would finally reach a level of calm. It wasn't going to go away, and nor should it, but the accounts of addicts had raised public awareness to the dangers of opium. In the Journal of Medical Sciences in 1889, a young girl described her withdrawal as such. My principal feeling was one of awful weariness and numbness at the end of my back. It kept tossing me about all day and night long. It was impossible to lie in one position for more than a minute, and of course sleep was out of the question. I was so irritable that no one cared to come near me. Now, combine testimonies like those along with the development of aspirin, a non-addictive and again easily available and affordable painkiller, and the demand for opium declines. Society had turned on recreational opium use in much the same way that society today has turned on smoking. And by 1912, after much campaigning by organisations such as the Christian Union for the Severance of the British Empire with the Opium Trade, because the Victorians know how to do a catchy title. Now, after decades of campaigning with them, an international treaty was signed by the 13 nations at The Hague. And this treaty, the first ever drug control treaty in history, became international law in 1919 as part of the Treaty of Versailles. Since then, all signatory nations to the League of Nations and now the UN have agreed to prohibit the sale, import, export, distribution and use of all narcotic drugs, not just opiates, except for medical and science purposes. That was over 100 years ago, and the war on drugs still continues. But that's a debate for a different channel. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.